At this point, we have two basic groupings of Norwegian Lutherans in America. We have the Eielson-Hauge grouping, and we have the Dietrichson, Preuss, Norwegian Synod grouping, even the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood, which, by the way, is the root of St. Olaf College. I don't know if there is any plaque there that says that we were the school of the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood around. I think they'd maybe like to forget that, but that's the heritage of St. Olaf College. And this particular group would continue on. There's an interesting individual who plays into this story, Professor F.A. Schmidt. Professor Schmidt was sent by Walther to teach at the Norwegian Lutheran Seminary, and he learned Norwegian and was able to do that. We don't know the man's personal motivations at all. There are those who accuse him of being jealous of somebody in Missouri Synod, that he thought he was going to get a position at Concordia and all the rest. But he broke with Walther and the Missouri Synod on this predestinarian issue. And to his dying day, fought that battle. They said that after he was long retired, I was told that he would insist on being brought back to Luther Seminary for a lecture once a year to straighten out the future pastors that there weren't any Missourians among them. And he was almost totally blind at that point, and they would lead him in, and the students would gather then, and I guess it was required, and he would begin to go over that whole battle, filling them in what had happened and all the rest. Toward the end of the time, I guess, I don't know if he was thinking clearly, or it was quite an ordeal, and so there were students who got up and who left, and of course he never knew it because he couldn't see, which was they would quietly sneak out. I still can see, however, so the third movement toward organization among the Norwegian Lutherans, I believe, represented the fact that there was a middle ground, that we're not completely at home with the, shall we say, extreme low church approach of the Haugians and the Eielson folks, nor were they at home with the Norwegian Synod. And in 1851, representatives of Norwegian, German, Swedish, and English, really American congregations, came together and adopted, and organized a new association called the Synod of Northern Illinois. In their constitution, they said, we subscribe to the Augsburg Confession as mainly correct. Some of the Scandinavians dissented, and they said this was vague, ambiguous, and made room for doctrinal compromise. They asked that their objections be recorded in the minutes. However, they stayed with the group. A seminary was established in Springfield, Illinois, and they became a part of one of the Eastern Lutheran groups, and I'm not going to try to untangle that at all, called the General Synod. The Scandinavians were in the minority at the beginning, but new waves of immigration came, brought new recruits to their ranks, and they began to demand changes in the Synod of Northern Illinois. After a couple of years, they struck the words mainly correct. They led to an adoption of a resolution that based church membership on doctrinal commitment We need to be straight and clear on our Lutheran convictions. The president of the Synod the president of the Synod of Northern Illinois, who was an American, English-speaking man, attacked the Scandinavians for trying to introduce European churchliness in the direction of Rome. He demanded that in America they be Americans. Tensions reached such a level that some wanted to actually dissolve the synod and organize new work. The president wrote secret letters to friends calling for a new English synod where we would ban the use of foreign languages. And he was unmasked at a special conference, say the records. His secret letters made public. He was charged with sedition, of all things, and so they went on. Be sure to have Scandinavian-speaking professors. This issue would continue to fester until finally, in 1860, the Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes withdrew and organized what was called the Scandinavian Augustana Synod. The Scandinavian Augustana Synod. 10 years later, the Norwegians and Danes removed themselves, withdrew. And they organized 2 new fellowships. That's always a puzzling story to me as I go over it. And it's hard for me to really sort it through how they withdrew as a group and how immediately split. 1870, 2 new Norwegian Lutheran denominations were organized, one called the Augustana Synod, Norwegian-Danish, centered at a town that you'd have a hard time finding on the map, Beloit, Iowa. Beloit, Iowa is right across the river from Canton, South Dakota. And they would move to Canton shortly and establish their school, Augustana Seminary, which eventually would become Augustana Academy, and then Augustana College, or is it a university today in Sioux Falls? I'm not sure. But that all is rooted out of this original group. The other group was called the Norwegian-Danish Conference, and they would be headquartered eventually here in Minneapolis. They began with a school in Marshall, Wisconsin, called Augsburg Seminary. The father of this wave, this middle ground of Norwegian Lutherans, was a pastor by the name of Claus Clausen, C.L. Clausen, 1820 to 1892. Clausen came over at the request, really, and at the expense of a Haugian businessman who had a son who had come to America and who was very heartsick about the lack of spiritual care that was being given over here. And so he sent Clausen over, who was a teacher of religion, and he would eventually end up working with Dietrichson, not totally fitting in there. Dietrichson accepted him and ordained him, and he worked with the Norwegian Synod for a time, but still more of a Haugian commitment this man had. And so when worked with the Synod of Northern Illinois for a time, when this new group started, or groups, he would become a real leader in them. A very fine man. This, by the way, is the second Norwegian Lutheran church building to be erected. And it was built in Wisconsin near the village of Muskego. It's called the Old Muskego Church. And it has been moved and restored and is on the campus of Luther Seminary over in St. Paul. And you can visit that and go inside and see what it looks like. It's a very unique building, small. You'll notice there is something that is not unusual for Norwegian churches, Scandinavian churches, but is for churches in America. The pulpit is built above the altar. Above the altar. And so you would, the pastor would walk up steps on the side and preach from up there. It was all kind of like one piece. Our direct line of history, I have to tell the story too. In the division between the Swedes and the Norwegians, yes, the Swedish numbers were increasing to the point where they were in a majority, and the Norwegians were concerned that their pastors would start preaching with Swedish accents or something like that, I suppose. They had their seminary at Paxton, Illinois, which some of you know, being from that area. It began in Chicago, moved to Paxton in 1863, and the president was a Swedish professor named Hasselquist. The first full-time professor was a pastor from Norway, so it was a Norwegian and a Swede, August Venås. It's Weenaas. Weenaas, I suppose we would pronounce it in English. And he was someone who was had been trained by Gisle Jansen, very schooled in those dogmatics, and that's what he taught there at Paxton. The ethnic rivalries overflowed. I guess that's the best way to put it. And one of my old teachers used to say that in the writings of Venås, they tell about him being invited to the home of Professor Hasselquist, and Mrs. Hasselquist for dessert served apple pie. And Venås wrote, "It was the worst apple pie that I had ever eaten." It was just terrible. And then, of course, underlying that is these Swedish women just don't know how to cook right. You know, that's would probably be the presumption there. But he even had to pick on Mrs. Hasselquist's cooking. So some of us used to say back in school days that that was the reason for the split. It was Mrs. Hasselquist's apple pie. Our narrowing in of the line of history takes us particularly to the conference, Norwegian-Danish Conference, which was organized in 1870. I have some sheets here someplace. Were they handed out? Yes, yeah. They were. You've got them. That's why I don't have them right here. I understand now. Giving you a little bit of a breakdown of some of these divisions and that took place. Never has a branch of Lutheranism probably been so divided as the Norwegian Americans. With no authority, really, in 1869, Venås announced that he would teach theology to the Norwegian and Danish students only. He wouldn't teach Swedes anymore. And he moved to Marshall, Wisconsin, and called the new school Augsburg. The conference, the church body that grew around the school, would be more churchly in their worship style, more traditional, more Norwegian than the Norwegian-Danish Augustana Synod, which supposedly was more Americanized. Their church polity also was distinctive. Clausen was the important influence, and he was reacting to what he thought was an authoritarianism in the Norwegian Synod, of which he had been a part. And so the name conference, rather than synod, was chosen deliberately. this conference was not to be an incorporated church body. The decisions of conventions would not be binding on congregations. There would be no powerful synodical church council. There was a fear, distrust of centralization. The conference saw itself as the middle ground between the authoritarian style and attitudes of the Norwegian Synod and what they thought was the lack of churchliness that represented the Eielson-Hauge Synod. They would become an attractive, rapidly growing alternative within Norwegian American Lutheranism. The Venus moved, by the way, the Norwegian Danish Augustana Synod controlled the property in Marshall, Minnesota, and so when that division came, Venus had to actually move the seminary into a nearby farmhouse in his own home for a time. And then a year later, they had an invitation to move to Minneapolis. Trinity Congregation, at that time located over in the what's called the West Bank area of the Twin Cities, invited the school to Minneapolis. Pastor Ole Paulson would be the key promoter of this move, interesting individual. And in September of 1872, classes opened in a new building that was constructed. Lots of stories about money being raised for this building. Paulson went around to business people in the Twin Cities, people who weren't Lutheran, people who weren't Norwegian. Donate toward this. This will be a great thing for our up-and-coming city. And at one point even borrowed a servant girl's savings in order to have enough money to meet a certain goal. This is another story which is a part of that. And to get the building built, the ground was freezing. And I was told this story many years ago. They said that Paulson was determined that they had to go ahead and get this building up. And they said, we can't do it because of the ground being frozen. Well, he said, if it's frozen, build on top of the ground. And so they laid out blocks on the frozen ground and put up this building. According to this legend went on for years, and the building lasted a long, long time. And finally, when it was torn down, many, many years later, this man who told me it, he said, I was determined to find out, was that true? Was it true? And he said, when they tore down the building, they found out there was no foundation. There was no foundation to it. And the building had been erected and continued on and served the school well for years. Hard ground. Yeah. New professors were brought to the school. New professors were brought to the school. And one of them, Sven Oftedal, arrived in 1873. He was a brother of Lars Oftedal, who was one of the most famous pastors in Norway, a great evangelist, referred to by some as the king of Stavanger. He was so popular, drew crowds, huge, huge crowds of people to hear his preaching. Sven Oftedal, a well-trained theologian, urged two of his friends, one of whom was Georg Sverdrup, to come and to join him, and they did the next year. The third one of the pair, Sven Gunnarsson, did not stay so terribly long. He would end up going back to Norway. Oftedal and Sverdrup would stay for their entire careers. I use the phrase advisedly, and I had somebody challenge me on it once. I call these guys young Turks. Okay, young Turks. Now someone said they had looked up Turks in Luther's works and found out that the Turks were Muslim and were to be condemned or something like that. And I said, no. Young Turk is an expression. It's a legitimate English term that means a young person who wants to get in there and see things change. And that's what these guys were. Both, well, Sverdrup, how can we even talk about his family? The most prominent family in Norway in church and state. There isn't a family that could compare to them. He had, his father was a prominent pastor. He had an uncle. The Prime Minister of Norway at one time was a Sverdrup. Just a very, very famous, and the family has produced explorers and all the rest from this family line. Certainly, church and state, the most prominent family in Norway. Oftedal's family, also very, very well known. These two guys had it made in the shade in the old country. They would have been able to step into leading positions of any kind as professors of theology, whatever they would have wanted to do. It was all there for them. But they were frustrated at the church-state relationship in Norway. They wanted to see the church freed from the state in some way, where the government wasn't appointing pastors and so on. They wanted to see a free church. And they found, that would be open to the moving of God's Spirit. They wanted to see New Testament congregations. They were terribly idealistic, dangerously idealistic. And they looked at the situation there and decided that it just simply wasn't workable at all anymore. And they walked away from it. And they came to America with a vision. And that vision was to make a new beginning among Norwegian Lutherans for New Testament Christianity. I like what Hamry writes in one of his journal articles. He said, it's almost, it almost takes your breath away, I think is the words he uses. Almost takes your breath away. Because he said, these two aristocrats, you might as well say, these two sons of these very prominent families gave up all of it because of this burning conviction that they had that America offered an opportunity for Christianity like had never been offered since New Testament times. And they wanted to be a part of that. And they wanted to see the New Testament congregation established among Norwegian Lutherans. The ideal of a free church in a free land, a spiritually alive church in which all the gifts of grace would be utilized and given expression, and it would be a self-governing, democratically led church, free from clerical, synodical domination. Yes, here's the quote. Oh, I have the quote right here in front of me from Hamry. Taken on its own terms, this is a breathtaking, even staggering concept. It involves nothing less than the idea that America offers Christians a chance to make a new beginning, to return to the New Testament pattern of Christianity. From Sverdrup's point of view, and Sverdrup would become the more prominent of the two, this was a unique period in the history of God's people. But it was a moment that must be grasped. This was the time to break out of the old ways and create something new. They came with what they called their Augsburg plan. This was their vision for theological training. They rejected what they called the old Latin school system. It was too humanistic. They needed to have a Greek system, a Greek school. The goal of theological education must not be to clutter the minds of students with citations, glosses, interpretations, or hair-splitting distinctions. Rather, it must be to lead them to a greater understanding of Jesus Christ, the heart and center of God's Word. A focus on Scripture rather than on a dogmatic, orthodox system was to be the heart of the program. Biblical theology. Biblical theology. And permeating this was what many saw as the arrogant notion that Augsburg had a special mission. When Venus left, Sverdrup would be named president of the school, and he would hold that position for the next 33 years. There was a division within the conference over this Augsburg plan. Some saw it, I guess they would say, where did this come from? I don't remember our adopting it or voting on it or anything like this. And so the conference was divided between what was called the New School, those who supported Augsburg and its mission, and the Old School, those who were probably had been there beforehand and wondered about these young Turk professors coming in with their radical ideas. There were no serious doctrinal issues at stake here, but differences in emphasis clouded by personality differences. The Old School objected to an alleged indifference toward doctrinal discussions. And also they were uneasy about the concept of congregational freedom. Oftedal, by the way, put out a paper, owned it, edited it. The name of it was Folkebladet, the People's Paper. And he used that as a platform for attacking anybody who disagreed with him, and pretty scathing at times. And it was a private paper, not under the authority of the church, and there were some that saw him as having, what, a censorious spirit. Yes, a censorious spirit. Oftedal was a fighter. He was of that particular kind of a confrontational personality where he maybe enjoyed the battles somewhat. Sverdrup responded to the criticism saying that the New School was not doctrinally indifferent, but had a deep concern that the presentation of doctrine that was given would be comprehensible to lay people, and that it wouldn't be talking over their heads. He used a word that would become kind of a byword in this controversy. The Norwegian word is barnelærdom, and the word means childhood learning, children learning. And that, to many people, meant something we've heard about already, Pontoppidan's Catechism. It meant what you were taught in confirmation, what you had learned, that's enough. That's enough. And when we get beyond that and start battling, for example, about double predestination, that isn't edifying. That doesn't build up the body, and it doesn't encourage spiritual awakening. Here's some statistics from 1890. Norwegian Synod, 570 congregations. They were still the largest, by far.
How many was that?
570 congregations. The Anti-Missourians, 211 congregations. Hauge Synod, 185. Norwegian Augustana, 80 congregations. And the conference, 453 congregations. During the late 1880s, the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood would become the catalyst for merger. would become the catalyst to try to draw all the Norwegian Lutheran church bodies together into one. This was not completely well received. Obviously, the Norwegian Synod was not interested. But the Hauge Synod eventually would step away from it too. But the Norwegian Danish Augustana and the conference, those three groups then, Anti-Missourian, Augustana, and conference, would proceed through this discussion and decide that there was sufficient unity of faith and life to be able to join together as one church body. And so they did. So they did. They had doctrinal discussions first. Sverdrup was opposed to it originally, and then finally thought, well, he'd like to be a part of this, thought it was a good thing, and was supportive of it. The agreement was made that Augsburg would be the school of the new church body. And so he thought, as long as that was the case, they would still have the influence in the training of the new pastors and so on. It was quite an event. This merger took place here in Minneapolis. The three groups met separately for their conferences, and then all came together, marched together to one meeting place, ended up meeting in the Swedish Augustana Church downtown, which was the largest auditorium available to them. And there was a great spirit of joy and celebration permeating this united conference that took place. Except for one shadow over it. And I suppose to this day, nobody knows just exactly what did happen. In one of the reports, it was said that Augsburg would be the seminary of the new church body, but the college would be St. Olaf. It was kind of like, wait a second, now, excuse me, what going on here? And somehow that had been worked into papers without the Augsburg people realizing it. Now they said the agreement was that Augsburg would be the training program for pastors. Yes, but we want to recognize St. Olaf here in it also. Sverdrup and Oftedal and the group that would become the Friends of Augsburg simply felt betrayed. They felt that the old school had united with the anti-Missourians and the Augustana people behind the scenes and had pulled a fast one. And they said, Augsburg is not just a seminary, it is a package. It is a plan for education. And the pastors coming through the college and the seminary, there is a unity to it. They accused St. Olaf of having a more humanistic view toward the training of pastors in their training. And exactly what humanism meant at that time to them, I'm not exactly sure. Not the way in which we talk about it today. But the use of Latin rather than Greek. Even in the names, by the way. Augsburg, what language is that? German. Augustana, what language is that? Latin, see? And so they deliberately called their school Augsburg to emphasize we're in the language of the people. We're not conducting our instruction, wasting our time, as it were, becoming experts on the Greek philosophers and the Latin teachers and so on in that way. There was even a hesitancy for a time at Augsburg to teach systematic theology. They felt that systematics should rise from biblical theology, from the study of Scripture. I have mentioned in connection with this something, and I don't even know that I have the notes anymore. Somebody asked me for them once. But I had a marvelous course in seminary by a teacher of that conviction, where we studied the book of Romans and the formula of concord together, and where to see how the formula of concord flowed from the book of Romans. It was just a delightful journey through the book of Romans in that way. Sverdrup would have appreciated that. That's biblical theology, where your theology flows from Scripture. Rather than taking, here is a doctrinal point, here are 1, 2, 3, 4 proof verses under it. He was leery of that kind of an approach to systematic theology. Okay. Although in later years did grant that it had to be taught in some form. I'm interested in it and don't know a lot about it, but in the Wisconsin Synod there was the Kaler controversy. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. Yes. Wasn't that somewhat of the same issue?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kaler and Pieper were at odds.
Yes.
Kaler was exegetical theology, Pieper was dogmatics.
Yes. Yeah.
And they never did resolve it to this day.
And there is still the Protestant conference that exists on fighting that battle. Yeah. Half dozen churches or something like that. The Kaler controversy, the little I've read about it, has somewhat of that same note in it. We want a biblical theology rather than merely a systematic theology with proof text verses tacked onto it. Okay. This was, Sverdrup said, and Oftedal said, this starts in the college. It continues on. This is a package deal. And this is a violation of our pre-merger agreements. And because the conference was an unincorporated church body, Augsburg College and Seminary, and at that time even including a high school academy, was separately incorporated under the law of the state of Minnesota. And this was something that no one had quite recognized. In fact, the incorporators of it had sort of forgotten about it, that they in fact were the owners of it all as far as that was concerned. And so it became an issue of turning over the school to the new church body, the United Lutheran Church. United Norwegian Lutheran Church is the new church body from 1890. I don't think I said that yet. You see it on your chart. They refused. They refused until this matter was settled. It becomes so cloudy at that time, after that, because there were so many personal issues involved, and so much animosity was generated by this. The Friends of Augsburg organized congregations that and pastors that were supportive of Augsburg and its mission. They tended to be located either in the Twin City area, western Minnesota, northern Minnesota, eastern North Dakota. Southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa tended to be old school. And they were the older churches, the older established churches. The ones that had younger pastors who had been trained at Augsburg tended to favor the Friends of Augsburg. And so there was issues there of loyalty to your school and loyalty to your professors and so on. But there was almost a geographical division, certainly exceptions to that, but almost a geographical division that emerged as well. The Augsburg controversy. Professor Sverdrup, Sven Oftedal. Oftedal, by the way, was so fluent in Greek that he would preach in Greek Orthodox churches here in the Twin Cities. Able to do that, yeah. And when he didn't have enough controversy going with the Augsburg controversy, he ran for the Minneapolis School Board. and got involved in some of those things too within the Twin City area, which is another story. Well, come on. Eventually, the United Church gave an ultimatum, and they said that the property will be turned over to us, or we will walk away from it. And they in fact did so. The seminary split, majority of students left, and they found rented quarters first on Franklin Avenue, I believe, ended up eventually in different places, but Luther Seminary would be the heir of that division. And 13 congregations, because of their allegiance to Augsburg and to the Augsburg plan in the midst of this controversy, were not seated at the annual conference. They were basically kicked out of the United Church as a result. A parish in Nobles County, Minnesota, I don't know about those congregations, what happened to them. Calvary in Wilmer, Minnesota, ELCA congregation today, as is Eagle Lake congregation. St. Petri in Minneapolis no longer exists. St. Luke, that no longer exists as such. The building is occupied by a Hispanic congregation, El Milagro. Trinity congregation is the campus church, meets on the campus of Augsburg College today. Our Savior's, Marinette, Wisconsin, an ELCA congregation. Zion in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, no longer exists. The Cumberland and Comstock congregations. The East Cumberland Church would become Section 10 Lutheran Church and was an AFLC congregation until this year, and they now formally disbanded. And that was one of the pioneer congregations. Escanaba, Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Escanaba, my home congregation, is now an ELCA congregation. Some of the people withdrew and established a Free Lutheran Church there. And then Bethany, Abercrombie, North Dakota, Bethania, which is the one of these congregations which is still a strong functioning AFLC church today. These congregations were the Rebel 13 that were kicked out for their allegiance to Augsburg and the Augsburg plan, and they would become the catalyst or the core of the group that existed from 93 to 97, known as the Friends of Augsburg. The Friends of Augsburg were all, at least originally, members of the United Church. They were organized at the 1893 United Church Convention, an informal movement of pastors and congregations who rallied to Augsburg's support now that the Synod no longer recognized the school. They had a second meeting in November, elected officers, committees, and 5 annual meetings were held from 93 to 97. And this would become eventually forming into a separate and a new church body. The deep wounds inflicted by this controversy cannot easily be exaggerated. Pastors were alienated from their congregations. Churches were divided. The Synod withheld support from home and foreign missionaries. Seminary graduates were refused ordination. Congregations were expelled. And both the secular and religious press debated the issues and belittled the personalities involved with no holds barred. How could anything good come out of such a strid, like the old Norwegians would say, out of such a mess? We'll find out next time.